Boker Tov, good morning everybody, welcome back. It is wonderful to be learning together. Today our topic is going to be, as we are understanding who is asking the question, looking at the goal of each of the commentators in the Torah, we move now into the era of the modern. This is a completely new space in time. And again, I want to thank Dr. Huberfeld for pushing me to go in this direction in the first place. I didn't think this would go so long, but there's just so much to unpack. We're now moving to the realm of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. As I started learning with him. There's no sponsor today, but I wanted to learn Nishmas Rabbi Kogan, who was unfortunately murdered yesterday by terrible people in the UAE. Nishmasai Eden, Hashem Yinkom Dameh, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should avenge the blood of all the Jews who've been killed throughout the ages, especially him up till now. And our learning should be Nishmasai and a chizuk to the Mishpacha, to all of Chabad. Let's learn a little bit of Torah. We now move into an era in which the era is defined by complexity. An era in which Judaism has to metamorphosize in a certain sense to try to cope in the new environment. What is this new environment that Judaism needs to cope in? It is the environment of emancipation. And it's such a complicated environment. You think for all these centuries, Judaism has lived in under persecution, in ghettos, as a subclass, as a group of people who are seen as a lower level of being and lower level of society in every society they've been in. And suddenly the walls fall down, the ghettos are broken, and this comes with at the time of the French Revolution, right? So the French Revolution changes all of this. What year is the French Revolution? 1790, right? So the 1790s going onwards, following the French Revolution, the ideas of secular liberalism, right? So as opposed to America, which was formed on the basis of actually the values of liberty, the values of freedom, but it was actually founded by religious people, which therefore differentiates where it went, which is, by the way, if you look at all secular revolutions, they are filled with blood. The Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution. When you look at revolutions that were led by religious individuals in the last 200 years, it was a little different in some ways. And so it's interesting that after the French Revolution, one of the ideas was liberté, right? And so therefore, that meant complete liberty, which to the credit of the founders, they actually, after killing the aristocracy, completely brutally, they gave freedom to even the Jews. And as Napoleon went on to conquer the rest of Europe and he moved eastwards till he was finally stopped in his tracks in Russia, wherever he went, the modernized, westernized democracies followed suit and liberated the Jews. Now, before we get excited about how free the Jews were, you should read about the 19th century Jews. So in Germany, as an example, Jews were still not allowed to own land. Right? So just with all the freedom that they got, which meant they were always precluded from essentially becoming exceptionally rich, right? Because no matter how much you could trade, if you couldn't own real estate, right, there was no way of embedding that, or there was no way of building on that. So just to put things into perspective, for all the freedoms they got, there was still a glass ceiling. Right? And they still succeeded and were hated for being successful in the society in which they were given freedoms. So just to put things in perspective, it wasn't full liberation. Okay, at least there weren't ghetto wars. So within this new construct, now Judaism had to figure out, how do we deal with this? And it wasn't very long before suddenly Judaism started changing very rapidly, and most of the time for the negative, right? So, and especially this happened in Germany, especially this was now where there now emerges a new, we'll call movement called the Haskalah, right? Haskalah literally means understanding, right? So it's almost as if the way it was describing itself, self-definition, was, now we finally understood things. Like now we finally got things. Up till now we were cloistered, we were in our Neanderthal thinking when we used to live in the cave and we didn't understand. Now we get it. And this was obviously running in parallel with a general resurgence of research in the world on all fronts. So at this point in time, now as you were moving into the 1790s, moving into the 1820s, that's a period in poetry called, just for those who are familiar, That's called the Romantic era. The Romantic era was not like many other eras. It was really founded around a group of poets. They all knew each other, right? So this is the Shelleys, right? This is Lord Byron, right? At this point in time, there's an explosion of scientific discovery. They are now looking out. Human beings are looking outwards to the planets. William Herschel is discovering new planets and new stars all the time, right? So Uranus is discovered at this point in time. And this is a remarkable time in terms of the macro scale. On the micro scale, the human body is being dissected, and there's now a question about where's the soul. That's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was written in 1818. Was this time? Is there a soul of the human being? Now discovery is moving geographically. Mungo Parks is making his way through Africa and is discovering new territory, new cultures. There's a lot of things that are going on at this point in time. As there's an explosion of discovery. As we move later on into the 19th century, we're going to have further discovery, archaeological discovery, right? The discovery of fossils. What were these creatures that we no longer have? How far back? Carbon dating. How far back is the Earth? How old is the Earth? Wait a second. Then the beagle returns. And we have this book called The Origin of the Species as we move into the 1850s. And suddenly, wait a second, maybe there's another mechanism in which human beings arrived at. There's now a discovery of biblical criticism. Maybe academically we can study and the Bible and question its authenticity, question its authorship. All this is happening around the world. And as Jews are exposed to this general, we'll call enlightenment of sorts, that the way it's called, religion as a whole is under attack, and Judaism specifically, and therefore many of the Jews who are allowed to be part of the society become part of this entire process. It is interesting that in the book called Jews and Power by Ruth Wise, really excellent book, she makes the observation that for all these years, the Jews had been pushed down, right? So therefore they had to somehow figure out how to succeed despite their incredible amount of limitations. So they weren't allowed this profession, they weren't allowed that profession, they weren't allowed to live here, they weren't allowed to do that, they weren't allowed to be a business owner, proprietor in this way. So now take away the glass ceiling and suddenly this adaptive people who've not been allowed to do most things that everybody else has done and been blamed for doing the things they were only allowed to do, right? These Jewish moneylenders, yeah, well, that's all you gave them to do, right? So then suddenly the ceiling disappears, or at least is raised, let's be honest. And so as the ceiling is raised, suddenly there's this dearth of success. And Jews now emerge in every rank of society, in politics and academia, in medicine, in law, in all these areas they've never been allowed to succeed in beforehand. And then everybody's like, why are they so successful? Why are they rising to the top? The answer is because you kept your foot on the back of their neck as they lay in the gutter for all these years. They had to adapt. And they were more adaptive than the regular people who didn't have that opportunity. That's what ends up happening, and the Jews now are rising in this way. And as they rise, these ideas filter through. And therefore, you have people like Moses Mendelssohn, very educated, very well written, very well schooled and lettered in Judaism and academia, and questions a lot of the basic premises of Judaism as well. And at this time, we have a fellow by the name of Adam Geiger, who's now arrives from the University of Bonn, who says, wait a second, like some of these ideas are like, a little bit antiquated, right? This idea of circumcision, it's like a bloodletting, it's like the Dark Ages, right? Why do we need this? This notion of Jews just marrying Jews as if we're so special. We've just been told that we're equal, right? That's what we're told. Look, I'm so successful, I can now earn a salary. I don't have to be a street sweeper. So now I can succeed. So Judaism now needs to adapt. You know what? Wouldn't it be better if prayer was in German? Because then the masses could understand it. Wouldn't it be better if, we just shave off a little bit here and adapt a little bit there? And this idea of praying just for the Jewish people, that's really the backwaters of history. So let's universalize this. We'll change the prayer book. And this becomes now the beginning of the Reformation of Judaism and the Reform movement. The Reform movement rises so fast and so powerfully, it dominates all of German Jewry at the beginning of the 19th century. So much so, just to understand this, Germany is not a country yet in its own way. Later on, it's going to become a country. But at this point in time, it's a bunch of duchesses, so it's all these different provinces run by their own duke. and and each of these different areas have their own power, and the religious power is given by the political power, which means say that it is financed through a Jewish tax. And at this point in time, the reform movement is so much in line with German liberal thinking at this point in time that the predominant dominating power in Judaism in Germany becomes the reform movement to such a degree that when they take over areas, they defund and remove any remaining traditional teachers. Right, so any the yeshivas, the yeshivas in Germany, which are run by what we now call Orthodox. Again, Orthodoxy the word never used to be had to be invented, because Judaism was just like what we've been doing for all these centuries. But suddenly now, when you reform it, the folks left behind are saying like, wait a second, what just happened, right? So those folks who we call the Orthodox today, they were defunded, they lost their yeshivas, they lost their positions, they were driven out of town, and this became it, right? This was where now we're moving, as we move into the 1840s, the 1850s, this is the future, right? So any modernized Judaism coming from this area is now on the lap of this. We should also be aware of the fact, just in terms of like moving forward for a second, in terms of American immigration, right? So just understand Judaism in America. The immigrants to the Jewish immigrants to America were first German and then Russian. And the German Jews who came to America for economic reasons were a upper class German successful Jews who came in, and they were incredibly successful here. So we talk about the cities, the institutions of New York City and beyond are built on German Reform Jews in general. And so later on, when the Russian immigrants, the peasants of Russia, who managed to sell every last living piece of furniture that they had in order to be able to make it out of the Pale of Settlement, when they came in and were settled in the Lower East Side, and as they came through the Ellis Island, it was the German Jews who were supporting them, right? The joint distribution, all of that was the German Reform Jews, which means that the Russian traditional Jews were arriving in a reform environment, which is why it was so complex, and there was such also an assimilation rate as well, because the institutions were already Reformed Jewish German institutions, which laid the groundwork of American Jewry. Complicated. American Reform is built on German Reform. Germany was the seat of the Reform movement, and this is where it started. Braunschweig, if you read about these conferences, we're going to deal a little bit more with this as we get to the Malbim, as we get to Shadal, as we get to Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg with the Ksava Kabbalah, Be'ezra Hashem. But now we get the chance to, within this environment, we get to appreciate one of the most illuminating figures of the 19th century Judaism, and that is Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch. Do you know what his name was? Everybody says, oh, Samson Raphael, Shimshon Raphael. That's not true. His name was Samson or Shamshon. Shimshon, but he was called Raphael because his father was called Raphael. That was his father's name. The way it works is in those days, the accepted norm was being called by your father's name second. Okay, Shimshon Raphael was his father. If you look on his tombstone, right, it's Shimshon ben Raphael. Okay, just an interesting societal norm which we don't necessarily have right now. So he arises at this point in time. He is schooled in Hamburg, and he gains his tutelage. He is able to learn at this point in time by the chief rabbi of Hamburg, whose name was Rabbi Yitzchak Barnayas, and he was schooled in traditional thought at the same time, also being schooled in modern ideas, which was now acceptable, which was now available to the Jews to learn. He also received his smicha, and having learnt with Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, and this is of course the person who writes one of the greats of the 19th century, or the 18th to 19th century, the Aruch Laner. So if you go to any base medrash, I'm just trying to see if we have one over here. I think ours is upstairs. It's a black. The Machon Yerushalayim version is this black, beautiful volume of Aruch Laner in multiple Masechtas. He wrote the Bikurei Yaakov on the halachas of Sukkah, and he wrote his famous responsa called the Binyan Sion. Okay, so remarkable German Jew of prolific, world renown, phenomenal individual who was the teacher of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and it's worthwhile. I meant to bring it here, and I didn't put it in, but there was a beautiful teshuva. There was a response of the Seridei Eish, Rav Michael Weinberg, who wrote a tshuva about a halachic topic. At the beginning of the tshuva, he writes in his footnote, and he says, I'm telling you who asked me this question. He goes on to describe this German rabbi, and he goes on to describe the excellence in Torah and the excellence in academia. He had a PhD, he was a traditional rabbi, he had a community, and he says, I want to tell you about him. And I want to tell you that he was one of the many incredible German Jews who lived, because most of them have been wiped out and nobody believes it can exist like that anymore. And he was talking about the idea of balance. And of course, Rav Hirsch Weinberg and Hildesheim's Yeshiva. You have to understand there was such a aristocracy of German Jewry, of traditional German Jewry. And we don't sometimes forget. We just sort of read the books on the shelf as if they're all, on a certain sense, around the same table. They are around the same table of Torah. But to understand, specifically the German Jews and the proficience that they brought to the table at such a complicated time, it's worthwhile appreciating the context of this. So Aruch LaNer Barnais were the teachers of Rav Hirsch. He grows up and he enters the University of Bonn. He studies theology, philosophy. It's not clear if he finishes his degree, because at the age of 21 he becomes the rabbi in Oldensburg. 23. He becomes the rabbi in Oldensburg. Oldensburg again is one of these provinces, these areas with its duke in Germany. It doesn't have a huge amount of Jews at this point. There's around 700 Jews in general in this particular area. I have to say I was very, very blessed. We had in our shul for many years a family called Breuer. They made Aliyah with their kids, Baruch Hashem. So once when we had them for we were out of towners, they were out of towners, which means to say that everybody else is with their family on Pesach, right? And goes away or has their family with us. So we were there by ourselves because, we don't get to go away on Pesach. And they were there with their family because they couldn't go away. So we had Pesach together. It was wonderful. And so they gave us as a gift the Rav Shimshon Rav Hirsch, because of course they come from the Breuer family, and the Breuer family is a direct line from Rav Shimshon Rav Hirsch. So it's a really wonderful biography. It's really excellently written by Rav Klugman. Rav Klugman, of course, is a German Jew from Washington Heights am Main. Right, so for those of us who are sensitive to this, when I grew up in South Africa, I went to Adas Yeshurun. And the way it works is, when it's a Monday or Thursday, there's 2 lights, not 3 lights which are on. And when the light bulb has 99 and a half hours, and it's supposed to, it says in the box that it goes for 100 hours, the gabbai changes it. Right? There's a way things work, and there's a different tune. When it comes to the Yomim Noraim, the Birkas Kohanim, there are 3 different tunes. One for Pesach, one for Shavuos, one for Sukkot. Yigdal has a different tune to the rest of the year. I mean, it's very hard. If you grew up in a German environment and you know that things are supposed to be the way they're supposed to be, it's very hard to realize that the peasantry of the rest of Judaism doesn't know anything about this. It's very difficult, right? It's nobody has. There's a way. It's pasnish. I'm not a German Jew, but I grew up and I go with a great appreciation of what it's meant to look like. So. At this point in time, he becomes the Rav, and it's a very difficult time because the Jews in the district are split between the Reform Jews and the traditional Jews, and the traditional Jews weren't ready for this wave. They weren't preparing themselves for major seismic shifts in Judaism, and so they were oftentimes left just without knowing how to deal with this. And it was and later on he moves over to being the Rav of Nikolsburg and finally Emden, and then Nikolsburg, and finally he was invited to Frankfurt am Main. It's interesting that when he goes to Frankfurt, there's only 11 families who are traditional. They invite him. There's nothing there. It's essentially a Reform county. A Reform area, and he builds up the community to what it is, to what it became, and becomes the rabbi there with great longevity. So he lives till 1888. He lives to 81 years old. Remarkable. And he builds a community l'Shem Tiferes. It's during these times in his early career that he writes 2 very important books. One is called the 19 Letters. He actually writes it under a pseudonym as Ben Uziel. He does not write under his own name at that point in time, and it's about a defense of traditional Judaism. He then writes another book called Chorev, which essentially is his encyclopedic way of subdividing all of mitzvahs into the different categories. So Chorev is a very famous book. I should have brought it. I just have it in my office next door. There's many reprintings of it. Most of the writing that he did was, of course, in which language? In German. He wrote it to the German people, and he says this. He talks about the importance of this when he writes his books, and he points out that throughout the course of Jewish history, many wrote to the lingua franca of the people and themselves. In his collected writings, he says, the giants of the Spanish Arabic era wrote most of their works in Arabic, thereby making them accessible to everyone in their circle. And so too in our own day, when unfortunately the knowledge of Hebrew and rabbinics have been relegated to the scholars' study, our people have the right to demand that those problems affecting their life and knowledge should be discussed in language they understand. Just out of interest as well, very interesting side point, Mamlo'ez was written in what language? Ladino, fantastic. Why do we have the Mamlo'ez on the shelf today in Hebrew and in English? Because the English version is, of course, written by Rabbi Kaplan, who learned Spanish to do the translation. He schooled himself in Spanish just to be able to translate the Mamlo'ez. Read the introduction, very interesting. Okay, so you can't translate a book unless you actually know the language. And so Rav Hirsch's writings today we have thankfully in English, but understand that it was now being translated twice. This is the second edition. I inherited my father's first edition, which is the blue set, right? Which is the original one by Dr. Levy. It's excellent. It's excellent. And now I remember when this came out. I bought this as soon as it came out. This was in the 2000s when the Breuer Foundation in Washington Heights commissioned. This took many years to do a translation into English. When we spent a few years ago a discussion about languages in general, remembering that people always hesitate translating greats before them into another language because of interpretation. So when Dr. Levy, who was a grandson of Rav Hirsch, translated this, and Dr. Grunfeld, and did some of the translations, they did it specifically word by word rather than sentence by sentence, which is why it's more difficult to read when it comes to a English-German writing than it is to read perhaps this, which suffers interpretation, but at the same time is easier to read. Just to appreciate this, he also wrote. He started a publication called Jeshurun, which obviously was very successful. Became a mouthpiece for a lot of the thought that he was trying to espouse. He also translated and wrote a pirush on Tehillim. And his notes on the Siddur were published posthumously after his death. His most famous and most respected work is his commentary on the Torah, and it is really something which, if you haven't read, then you're missing out a very significant part of your Judaism, because it's really is remarkable, and that's what we're going to be focusing on right now. I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time. It is so vast, it is so big, it is so prolific, it is so profound. There's no way we can possibly get there, but to understand the milieu in which he's talking, the sensitivities he's talking to, and his ability to be able to stand fast on the issues that really matter at the same time as understanding that Judaism has relevance and has meaning and has lessons to the modern era is really built on the foundation of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch with his Torah im Derech Eretz, which he builds straight out of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, the idea of that Judaism is able to weather the complexities of any era because of its tradition, because of the fact that it is adaptable. It is not adaptable in terms of changing the norms, but applying the norms differently is remarkable. And that's why when he walked into shul, his shul was built with great respect, with great pomp and circumstance. He wore robes. He had an all-male choir, right? So some of the things that the Reform Judaism were doing, which was to aggrandize Judaism and make it more like the church, he said there are things to be learned. There are good things, but there's tradition, there's halacha as to how things can be done. We don't just bring the organ into the synagogue, right? So into the temple. So it's very, very complex era that he's living in. Let's try to appreciate some of his writings. So in his introduction to the Torah, he tells us what he's about to do. Again, we're reading the translation because it was written originally in the German. And so here's what he says. I seek to explain, he says on page 5, the biblical verses on their own, to draw this explanation from the literal expression through all of its facets, to pull the explanation of the words from the treasury of the language of the Holy Writ, to draw and to describe by way of linguistic research. I will draw from the traditions of law and lore, which have been transmitted to us from the days of our predecessors, together with the biblical text upon whose truths upon which is based the worldview of the Jewish life. And he goes on to describe this. So he's already said for us a few very important ideas. He's talked about tradition, he's talked about law, and he's talked about language. These are all very important things to Rav Hirsch. Let's explore each of those individually. Language. Language is incredibly important to Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. And that's why, if you're familiar, there's an excellent work out there called the Etymological Dictionary, Rav Hirsch's Etymological Dictionary. What is it? It is not written by him, but it's taking all of his explanations on the Torah in which he synthesizes word patterns and creates a dictionary out of them. Remarkable. So I'll go through a few examples in a moment. But the place to look to appreciate this is his explanation in Bereshis Yud Aleph. Why? Because that's where the Torah describes there used to be one language, Safo Echas V'Dvarim Achadim, and then after the Tower of Babel, what happened was God split up everybody and allowed them to speak in different languages. So as the proliferation of language expands, that's where Rav Hirsch writes this, really a magnum opus on language here. I included it, but without going through all the details. He describes the following in the bottom of page 5, the bottom left paragraph. He says, what are the elements to a formation of a language? Such a great question. There are, or can be, two objective formation and two. Objective formation and subjective formation. Language expresses the essence of things and indicates the nature of their relationship. Language can be formed objectively, that is to say, it expresses the objective essence of things and the nature of their relations to the world. Alternatively, language can be formed subjectively in accordance with the particular attitudes of that nation currently about things and their relationships. Right? So therefore it becomes more a reflection of the subjective norms and attitudes of that nation. His argument by the Tower of Babel is that the world, when it was Safar Echas V'Dvarim Achadim, was the holy language, was Lashon HaKodesh. At the time they had Lashon HaKodesh, it was objective because the world was created with Lashon HaKodesh. Later on, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed language to diversify, that's when subjectivity entered languages, which is why each language has subjective norms invested or imputed into those languages. He gives a number of examples, and he's using German because that's his reference point. But just take a look at the bottom right paragraph as an example. Perhaps in German, one who is simple and unpretending, schlicht, is bad, because what's bad? Schlecht. So schlicht and schlicht is simple. Schlecht is bad. He says, accordingly, a German who does not want to be bad must steer clear of simplicity and straightforwardness. Cunning and wile are good qualities, meaning the language is expressing an attitude towards simplicity versus cunning. According to Jewish conception, however, yosher is a quality worth striving for. So meaning, you say, no, language is just simply, it's semantics, right? It's just a way of describing reality. So no. It is a subjective reflection of what matters in your culture to that reality as well. And he goes on to give multiple examples over the next page of these subjectivities. I remember reading a very fascinating study that when it comes to gender awareness, just to be aware of this, is children now forgetting what's going on today and what's going on in Congress, because people are getting very confused these days. But in Finland, children are able to understand their identity earlier than children in America, and children in Israel are able to understand their gender identity earlier than in America, but later than in Finland. Why is that? Because the language is based on that. In Hebrew, you actually need, every word is conjugated with feminine or masculine, which means you start talking about yourself and others in such a way. Now, that in Finland, in fact, it's not just the verbs and conjugations, it's every word, which means to say that it starts earlier depending on the language interpretation of self. There's more than that. They've found that Aborigines, this is one of the native tribes in Australia, are able to find or have a greater sense of direction as children than Western children. They try to figure out why that is. And the answer is, in the research has shown, is that when it comes to a Western child, we're taught directions as you go right or left, and you place the knife on the right and the fork on the left. In the Aborigine language, you don't use the words right and left. You use north, south, east, and west, which means how do you set the table? You put the fork on the north, and the knife on the south. Which means that the way you talk actually reflects the ideas that you are So this should be. That's what subjective language means. The cultural norms affect the way we talk, and therefore affect the way we understand, and therefore affect the subtle biases that we have. And Rav Hirsch points out that Hebrew is not such as well. He says, take a look at the page 6, second paragraph on the left. He says the same applies to the word religion. Every European language speaks of religion. He says, we, the people of religion, par excellence, have no term for religion. Right? Today we sort of use the word dat. Right? But that's a sort of like a throwback to try to figure out what that means. It usually means culture. It says, if religion is one aspect of life, it can be assigned a name. Its name defines it, delimits it, isolating it from other things. The other aspects of life are not included in religion, which has its own separate realm. That's what Mendelssohn said. Be a Jew in the home and a mensch in the street. Right? So that you see that's the drive what he's saying here. If, however, all of life is connected with religion from birth until after death, then no one can fathom the character of religion or assign it a name, inasmuch as it informs everything, and everything is included in it. Right? So that's why there isn't even a word for religion. So brilliant. And he talks about being. He converges the words in the next paragraph. Take, for example, the concept of existence. Some people identify existence with eating. Isn't this sad? Listen to this. He says, if a person does not exist, ist, unless he eats, ist, right? The meaning eating and existence are related. He says, that's terribly sad. That's terribly sad. I mean, that is the way it works. Like American runs on Duncan, right? I think American walks very slowly on Duncan, right? That's really, you can't run after a while, right? But like, the point is, if that's why you live, to exist, that's expressed in the language. He says, according to the Jewish conception, however, thought leads to existence, and existence leads to life. Look at the words he uses. Haya, that's existence. Hageh, thinking. Chaya, living. Notice what he's doing, by the way, now, is this is a very, very important part of Rav Hirsch's explanation, is that there's a convergence of letters. Do you notice, of course, that there are 5 different places in which we express or articulate sound, right? There's the throat, there's the palate, there's the tongue, there's the teeth, and there's the lips, right? So these are all letters. So the plosives, bumaf, those are the letters that all come from the lips. Gikak is all the palate. Those are, just so if you're learning Hebrew, now, the graniot, the ones that come from the throat, is reya ahach, right? That still comes from the throat. Those all come from the throat. So each of these different, all the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and all the 26 of the English alphabet. Of course, there's 26 in Hebrew in English, not because they invented new letters, it's because the vowels are the letters, right? Hebrew, they've got the nukudos involved in the dots, right? They don't need extra letters. But in the different places that the letters come from, certain areas that produce sound have interchangeability. And Rav Hirsch will use that all the time, which means, let's say you have a ches and a hey, which is what he's doing here. Ches and hey are both graniot, right? They both come from the back of the throat, if pronounced correctly, right? Sfaradim and Temanim are a little better in this. So they are interchangeable. Therefore, chaya and haya are actually interchangeable ideas, not just sounds. That's what he's doing here. Okay, so he'll actually, this is the phonetic dictionary where the idea of the convergence of ideas. He'll often converge a bays and a pay, both plosives, right? In fact, at the beginning of the section, he talks about the idea of balal and palal as ideas of coming into mixture or coming into place as well. He goes on to describe mother and father. I mean, this he doesn't say specifically over here to the fullest extent, but of course, the idea of av, a father being aleph beis, right? So it's the next step, right? It's the notion of a unit now moving into plurality, right? So it's the extension of that is aleph beis, which is father. But of course, as we know, that's really the father is of the three partners in creation is the most insignificant of those partners, and therefore the father takes step 1, right? But if you want to look at mother, that's aleph mem, right? So to full gestation requires somebody else who's going to do most of the work to actually, thank you very much, to allow life to come into this world. That aleph, of course, mem it's taking that first idea and now taking it to the next level, which is to the center of the Hebrew alphabet, which is the mem. The full idea of the Hebrew alphabet would be aleph mem taf, which is emet, but the jury's out on that child until the end of their life, right? So the mother can give them the start of taking that first idea of av, moving it to aim, right? And therefore and that's why a child, of course, is a ben, which is the same root as binyan, which is building, right? So All of these ideas are just built in the language, right? So you translate it to English and German, you're completely lost, right? So because as you point out, Mutzar and Vater, there's nothing to that. There's no relevance. There's no interaction with those ideas. They're just simply the convenience, the way we talk about things, and therefore he describes at the end. He says God taught man. The bottom right, second last paragraph. He says God taught man to speak in Safa Achas. Through this language, he taught man the nature of things and their purpose. This was the language which God himself designated things for man. This language reflected a certain view of things, and it was God's will that man's wisdom should be based on this view. And what happened at the Tower of Babel was that split up. So one of the basic premises of Rav Hirsch is the idea of language and the importance of language. It's just an example of this. Rav Hirsch will point out, for instance, the idea is that the word for inheritance in Hebrew there's a few words, but one of the words that we use is nachala, right? And the word for nachal also means, a raven also means a valley. Right, so Rav Hirsch will explain that the word nachal, nun ches lamed, of course means the idea of something which is on high, flowing down low. Right, that means to say it is a movement from high to low. That's the concept. So it expresses itself. A valley is the movement from high to low, which is how rivers flow, which is why nachala, which is inheritance moving from one generation to the next. Of course, they're all related ideas because that's how ideas work. Right, so you need Hebrew for that. So that's Rav Hirsch will always move back to language as the basic concept, and some of the letters will be interchangeable depending on the places of speech because of Hebrew conveying itself in 5 different, we'll call it categories of sound, not even just letters themselves. He also has a very, very famous idea about the oral and written Torah. This is one of the predominant, we'll call it vulnerabilities or the places of battle, the battle lines of traditional Judaism, where what will happen is the Reform Judaism will arrive and say, hey Mamru, listen, they said what they said, but they were kind of like, antiquated, backwater, dark ages folks who didn't know anything about anything. So we, our enlightenment, are now going to explain to you how things work, and we're going to explain it. So the oral law kind of fell by the wayside. We'll take the Bible, the parts we like, right, that's written, we'll give a certain respect to our, sort of having a differential kind of, nice, cultural background. But generally speaking, the sages, that can be dispensed with as well. Geiger, who was a contemporary of Rav Hirsch at Bonn, they actually formed a club together. He became the leader of the Reform movement. One of his greatest attacks was the Talmud, the sages of the Talmud. So how does Rav Hirsch relate to this in his defenses? He describes in the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim this remarkable idea. He says, have you ever been to, if you remember, you go to a really complicated class, you go to a physics class, and there's a visiting professor, and you take notes on that experience, and it's overwhelming. There's this world-renowned physicist comes to town, and you're taking notes, and it's so complicated because the concepts are complicated, and a friend who wasn't there then says, can you share your notes? So you see now, and we're not talking about computer notes today, where you got 5 tabs open. We talk about when you're actually taking notes and actually focusing, right? So now you have these handwritten notes, and you give them to your friend. Is it useful for him? No. Not really, because they didn't have the experience. They didn't, right? And so when you now write and you underline that section, you put an NB in the column and you circle that word, and because what you're trying to do is you're trying to make yourselves reminders. Or that when in 5 years' time you pull out those notes again, you're like, yes, the idea, the concept, the experience is now coming back to me. I get it all now. The guy wasn't there. It's like, why did he circle that word? Right? He didn't have the epiphany. He didn't have the moment. He didn't know anything about it. He says that's the relationship of Torah Shabbat Pen, Torah Shabbat Sav. This is completely counterintuitive to the way we were taught it, which means that the Torah Shabbat Sav is the lecture notes of the experience of Sinai. That's the way he understands it. Which is the predominant part of the Torah, according to Rav Hirsch, is the Torah Shabbat. That was the concept, that was the lecture, that was the experience. Now you take a book and you say, I don't need the lecture, I'm going to figure it out from that. You're like, you Philistine, you have no idea. You're looking at the lecture notes and you see there's a big letter or a dot. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what the lecture was about. You don't know the living, breathing experience of Judaism. You're pretending that's Judaism. That's nothing. Right? That's that, and you can understand the attack on the Reform Jury right now because you're missing the piece. You're missing the picture. Once you have the picture, then the Torah Shabbat Sav makes sense. This is different to what we're going to see the Malbim is doing, by the way. The Malbim lives in the same milieu, the same era. The Malbim does the opposite. The Malbim says, if you were to really study the written law, you would see it all emerges, the oral law emerges naturally, organically out of the written law. Rav Hirsch says, no, you need to know the oral law to understand the lecture notes. It's a very different way of looking at it, And this is the way, therefore, so that's why if you look at Rav Hirsch's explanation, he goes into the halacha, in the Torah Shebaal Peh, and he explains it all, and then he gives the reasons behind it, because that's the concept that he's trying to bring to us as well. It's sad when people all they start off with is, as if they think, without having been lettered in any of the rabbinic thought, and they open up a Torah and think that they have the right to have an opinion with their cultural baggage on the holy word of God. It's like, yeah, you're missing a bunch, right? You got to have both, right? So that's what Rav Hirsch was saying over here. Very fascinating. That was his introduction to Mishpatim. Again, he puts his ideas, the general ideas, into parts of the explanation. Another very famous idea. Hang on, just one, because I'm got so much to cover. We haven't got to the concepts yet. These are just the basic building blocks of his commentary. Now there's tradition. There's a mitzvah in the Torah at the beginning of Parashat Tzav, which is called Trumas HaDeshen. What's Trumas HaDeshen? Literally means to say raising. What's Deshen? Ashes. So the first, if you learn the Mishnah and Talmud, the first avodah done every single day was called Trumas HaDeshen, and it was sought after avodah. It was taken and the Kohen would take the ashes that were on the mizbeach from the previous night, and he'd bring it up and he'd lift it up. He'd lift up the Trumas HaDeshen. In fact, there's a book called the Trumas HaDeshen, written by Rav Yisrael Isserlin, who was one of the Rishonim, based on this pasuk. And listen to this. Just you can just sort of close your eyes and listen to Rav Hirsch. It's just so good. He says the following on page 9, and again I'll give you the full source, but I'm not doing it. He says the following. He says it's interesting. He says that he points out that the beginning of every day starts with yesterday, right? Isn't that interesting? The beginning of the service of today starts off with the ashes of yesterday, and he says 5 lines on the bottom of the top paragraph on page 9. The very last Jewish grandchild stands there before God with the same mission of life that his first ancestors bore, and every day adds to all its predecessors in the whole passing of the centuries his contribution to the solution of the task given to all generations of the house of Israel. The Jewish today has to take its mission from the hand of its yesterday. It is so good. That's how Rav Hirsch viewed life. You start today by picking up the ashes of yesterday. You don't wake up today and think, I have invented Judaism. Who are you? Where did you come from? Where do you think right? You are part of a much larger constellation of a moving, a living, breathing experience called Judaism. Be humble when you're part of that experience. Understand that your job is to make sure your grandchildren can speak the same language of Judaism as your grandparents. It's not you. You're not the arbiter, right? So people often say, Rabbi, cut me some slack. I'm like, I don't cut slack. I didn't make the rules, and I'm not waving a magic wand to change the rules. If and when the Mashiach comes and I'm asked to be on a council, I will have a few suggestions, but I myself am not changing any laws. I'm conveying to you what your relationship to God ought to be based on what tradition has said, but I didn't make it, right? I'm simply helping you, encouraging you to get to the right place with your relationship with God. That it's bigger than me. It's bigger than any individual. That's what Rav Hirsch is saying. So this is another concept. And finally, the importance of law and action. He talks about Avraham Avinu, tzedakah and mishpat, how your goodness, your righteousness has to be educated by your justice. It can't be that suddenly, and this is so sad today, how many Jewish foundations save the whales and these zoological societies. I love animals. But that's misguided goodness, folks. When there's a lot of bad in the world, there's a lot of other things you can be doing first, right? And look at the pavilions in all these places. They're all Jewish names. Such a good Obergegebenkeit. So good, but misguided. You need to have law to guide righteousness. It can't be just righteousness as I feel, because then you're serving yourself. You're not serving anything bigger. And that's what he points out. So much so, and I'd like to point to this point, which is the most famous idea. It's so exquisite. It's hard to, you can't go through this without this idea. That's there's a Deborah. So we've done this a few times, but just a quick recap for a moment, okay? Why the 10 Commandments? Like, there's a lot of mitzvahs. There's 613 of them. It's like 10 of them. Why do they get to go on the stones and not the other ones? Right? So like, how does this all work? So Rav Hirsch says, if you divide all of the Aseret Dibros into 3 classes of human expression, which is thought, speech, and action. Right? That's what's called Machshava Dibur Ma'aseh. So you divide them into that. You will notice that the Aseret Dibros are in chiastic structure, which means to say A, B, C, C, B, A. That's how it works. What does that mean? The first two Aseret Dibros is Anochi Hashem Elokecha, belief in God. Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim. Al Ponai, don't believe in, not the lack of belief in false gods. All are regulating thought, emotion, right, inside. The next, don't take Hashem's name in vain, is of course regulating speech. Then you have Zachor Shamar Sema Shavas and Kabed Savicha V'Simecha, which are regulating action. So it goes. The first half of the Aseret Dibros regulates thought, speech, action. The second half of the Aseret Dibros, those are all regulating action. The next one is don't be a false witness, of course, is speech. And finally, is regulating emotional thought, right? So what it means to say is that if you look at Aseret Dibros, it starts with, I'm just trying to work out, everybody's right and left over here for a second. Okay, so I'm going to go right to left as Hebrew Torah goes. So it starts off with thought, speech, action, goes from action, speech, thought, right? So it's chiastic in structure. You notice that? Then of course we know that there's a reason why there's not one tablet, there are two tablets, is because one is about Ben Adam Lamakom, is we'll call our vertical relationship, and the other one is our Ben Adam Lachaver, which is our horizontal relationship. Rav Hirsch says, what is the greatest excuse in the ritual world that people say? They say God. They say, Rabbi, I'm a Jew at heart. I'm a good Jew. Right? I believe in God. Like, why are you telling me that I can't drive to shul? Right? Like, so Rav Hirsch says, it's not enough. When you live in the realm of ritual, it's not enough to be good at heart. It starts there, but it needs to turn into the way you treat your Shabbos and you treat your parents. It needs to move from thought to speech to action. And when it comes to the other realm in social realm, what do people say? So I'm not hurting anybody. As I'm salivating, looking at their car in their driveway and wishing I had it. Right? I didn't do anything. Right? Right? Well, it's not really defamation because I didn't say it publicly what I say at the Shabbos table about my neighbors and about what goes on. It's like, no. It's not enough not to hurt people. Right? It's not enough to regulate your action. It starts with action, but it needs to be regulated into the way you speak and the way you feel. Which means that Rav Hirsch says that the Torah is now pulling us away from the norms in ritual and in social. That's what's happening. And that's the word he says. It's remarkable, right? Take a look at source 6. Spirit must be developed into letter, into act. All acts must have their source in the spirit. And this is the inspiration that hovers over these fundamental issues of God's Torah and fuses the two tablets, the religious and the social, into one inseparable whole. Remarkable! I mean, will you ever read the Aseret Dibros the same again after learning Rav Hirsch? It's impossible. Okay, so these are based on the basic concepts to understand. Now he speaks to, so true, right? It's so relevant. It's exactly what we need to hear today. That's what he's speaking to. Let's look at he deals with some of the sensitivities of the age. I want to deal, up to now we've looked at some of the basic building blocks. Let's look at the sensitivities of the age that he deals with. So one of the ideas that of course is very difficult for many is the idea of the chosenness of Israel. Well, you racist people, you think you're so special. Every other people think they're special and it's not racist, but apparently when the Jews do, it is. Okay, nonetheless, so let's deal with this. You know what I mean? It's like, nobody's saying like Islam, which wants to do jihad and kill the rest of the world, is racist. But Judaism, who might have laws which are different to a Jew and a non-Jew, suddenly becomes as racist. And who's the biggest critic? The Jews, right? So this becomes a thing. If we're really liberally freed and we're dealing in a democratic society, how could it be that we're different? So Rav Hirsch is very obviously from coming to the rational camp over here. Gives respect, speaking to people who are dealing and struggling with these sensitivities at the same time as living a traditional lifestyle. Points out in source 8, on the fourth line, he quotes a Gemara which says that he quotes in Hebrew at the beginning. This is how he does it, and he says, "I've separated you out of the nations." This is in the name of Rabbi Berechi b'Shem Rabbi Abba. It is as one who picks out the best from the lesser good, and then goes on picking out the good ones. But one who picks the bad out of the good throws the bad away and has nothing more to do with them. So that in no wise or ways does Jewish thought look on the choice of Israel's rejection of the rest of humanity. It regards the choice of Israel only as a beginning, only the starting of the spiritual and moral rebuilding of mankind, only the first step to the future, where v'nilvu goyim rabim el Hashem v'yomahu v'yuli la'am v'shachanti b'saychech, meaning to say chosenness is as a mission, and chosenness is as a start to the reformation of all of humanity. has to just understand that the idea of chosenness within this context. This is not going to be the language you will read in the Maharal. This is not going to be the language you're going to read in the more spiritual, we're called machshava based ideas. Rav Hirsch over here is a much more sensitive, rational relationship of the idea of chosenness, and this obviously is a major divide in Judaism in terms of understanding it in traditional Judaism. Now the idea in terms of the role of women, here Rav Hirsch in his commentary on the Siddur, which is obviously published after his death, but it was his writing. He makes an observation about the first three brachos, not three, but the towards the beginning of the brachos, Shalosani Gever, Shalosani Aved, Shalosani Nachri, Shalosani Isha, Aved, Shalosani Isha. He says in the fourth line, these three aspects of our own status impose upon us duties much more comprehensive than those required of the rest of mankind. And if our women have a smaller number of mitzvahs to fulfill than men, they know that the tasks that they must discharge as free Jewish women are no less in accordance with the will and desire of God than those in their brothers. Which means the bracha is not about better or worse, it's about relationship to responsibility, and it happens to be that men have more obligations than women, and a Jew has more obligations than a non-Jew, and so therefore these classes about relating to Hashem. Thank you for, we'll call it, extra responsibility, which are needed to reform me in this particular situation. As we can understand the sensitivity which he is speaking to when it comes to this particular idea. If you look at Rabbi Eliyahu Mank, of course, also of German extract, this will follow in his Pirush on the Siddur as well in a similar context. The attitude towards war, this is one of the difficult things, is do Jews love war? It's amazing. The word that was created to describe the intentional elimination of a particular race or creed is genocide. That was created because of Jews, because of Holocaust. That's where the word genocide emerged, 1942. And it's interesting how perverse it is that it's being used now with Jews who are intentionally trying to save lives, with people embedding themselves among civilians. So he says, but wait a second, how do you deal with the fact that the Torah tells us to eliminate the 7 nations in the land of Canaan, right? So this is a very famous Rav Hirsch. This is so helpful. You listen to Source 11. He says, the repeated admonitions not to have any mercy on the Canaanite population shows how much such a merciless procedure goes against the grain of the Jewish people and is against what they are meant to be, which is and is to remain the predilection to protect all living creatures. Meaning, why does the Torah have to go out of its way so many times to say lo yisachayeh kol neshama? Because this is a once-off command of God which we can't understand and is meant to not be what we are. That's why the Torah has to say it so many times, because it is the anomaly of human existence, which is why there is no other war that is lo yisachayeh kol neshama with the exception of Amalek. Why Amalek? Which is why he goes on to describe what does the paragraph of Bichias Amalek in Parshas Kisei follow. It immediately follows the parasha of what? Of the way of weights and measures, the way I treat people with justice, a society which runs based on transparency, on accountability, on care for the other person. He says, that's who we're supposed to be. There's one nation on earth that is the opposite of this. There's one nation on earth, one concept on earth, which is the idea of cruelty, taking advantage of the poor, taking advantage of the weak. That's called Amalek. We cannot live our society when there's such a society which exists as well. This is, and by the way, this ironically, Rav Hirsch was writing this, and within 60, 70 years, the place he lived was the place that turned into that monstrosity with their genetic programs and the T4 program, which was in Germany itself. Terence Grasser Boulevard number 4 was where the euthanasia started happening in Germany. And so, but that is Amalek. We cannot live in a world where we are supposed to be expressing God's will of kindness, of justice, of transparency, in a world where there's such a thing exists. It doesn't work. There's a very famous idea, we're just going to close with a few last ones, and then we'll hold it here. One is providence, divine providence. How does divine providence work? This is such a famous idea, and this is based on language. When it says in Parshas Chukas that the nation of Israel started complaining about being in the desert and the bread and the whole business, so it says Hashem sent them against them the Nechashim Asrafim, the burning snakes. Well, it doesn't say that. It says Vayeshalach Bam. Being sensitive to the nature of Hebrew, there are 7 binyanim in Hebrew, for those who study this carefully. And the word Vayeshalach is the binyan PL, not the binyan Kal, which means, if I were to say I were to send, it would be Vayeshlach, God sent. It doesn't, it says Vayeshalach, one extra dot. That means to say it's binyan PL. PL does not mean to say it is active, it is more passive, which means, It means to say that God is releasing, not sending. So you say, isn't that just semantics? The answer is no. Says Rav Hirsch. They're complaining about their godly protection. Too much God in their face in the desert. We don't want God. God, we just want a little space. God says, with pleasure. Enjoy the desert. Vayishalach bam es anachashim asrafim means to say, I will release you into the reality without my presence and enjoy what it lives in deserts. They're called snakes. God did not send the snakes. God allowed them out of the bubble of his existence, which means the way we relate to God, if you think about this from the perspective of providence, is if we don't want God in our faces, God very happily, or not happily, sadly, steps away. And we're released into the dog-eat-dog world without God. That's what, and that's from one dot. Right, in the Torah, that Rav Hirsch makes this observation. Okay, just being sensitive to the Hebrew language, which releases this, very, very, very much related to our way. How much do we want Hashem in our lives? That's a choice that sometimes we have to make ourselves, because sometimes we ask Him to leave. Anthropomorphism. This is fascinating. In Rav Hirsch's observation, the Rambam and the Rishonim wage a terrifying war against those who anthropomorphize or anthropopathicize. Just make it clear. Anthropomorphize, giving the deity, giving God a body. Anthropopathism is giving God emotions, pathos, right? So the Torah does this multiple times. Vayicharaf Hashem, God gets angry. That says the Rambam, Dibra Torah Kaloshim in Adam. The Torah is expressing in the ways that we can understand it. God does not get angry. God does not lose his temper. God does not have a face. God does not have a hand. God does not do any of these human things. It's translating it in a way that we can possibly understand it. Says Rav Hirsch. But then why did the Torah say it like that? Meaning, that's very confusing. Meaning, the Rambam will tell you, you lose your chelik in Olam Haba if you believe that God is a big, bald, bearded, white figure with glasses floating above the earth. That's a Christian conception, right? That's called anthropomorphism. That's not God. God is not a being. He doesn't read books. I remember there was like a Far Side comic, and it was like a picture of that kind of God, like with like spices on the wall, and it said stupid people, and he was like shaking them to the earth. God senses humor. That's Apikuros, according to the Rambam. You'll lose your chelik and believing that kind of nonsense. Okay, so it says Rav Hirsch, but then why would the Torah describe God like that? That's like very confusing, right? The stakes are so high and you're doing it. He says, because there's a greater danger. He says, and this is such an observation at the end of Parashas Noach, where it says, that Hashem regrets making human beings. That's an anthropopathism. So why? He says, because to assume that God is completely objective and is therefore outside of the realm of human thought and emotion would mean to say that God knew that human beings would sin, and therefore it was all set up ahead of time, and God very clinically and very coldly just appropriated the punishment necessary because he knew we were about to do this. But that's a dangerous way of looking at God, because God actually does care. He gave us the license to make decisions, and he cares, and he is, so to speak, upset when we make the wrong decisions. Vayinachem Hashem, which means to say there is a relationship with humanity, and God will convey the fact that he has a relationship with us at the risk of us misunderstanding him. That's what Rav Hirsch points out. And remarkable. Now, it's so interesting because he, as much as Rav Hirsch is in the rational camp of Judaism, he also sways away from rationalism into the notion of pathos, into religion as well, into the idea of having a relationship. Two last ideas, and we'll conclude, because again, there's far too much for the time, but it was just two last ideas, and I apologize for holding you. Here we go. The idea is vayis palel, l'tfila. We use the word tefillah. Tefillah means prayer. What is the word? And what does it mean? Rav Hirsch points out that the word prayer, palel, comes from the word pelilim, which is used in the Torah to describe judgment. It is which binyan of the 7 binyanim. Hitpalel is hitpael. Hitpael is reflexive. So for instance, ani lovesh means I wear. Amini mitlabesh means I dress myself. So that, again, this is Hebrew, beautiful. It's the same word, conjugated differently, means different things, right? So ani mitlabesh, I dress myself. Palel means I judge. Ani mitpalel means I judge myself. Meaning prayer is the concept of self-judgment, which means it is, in fact, the way he says it, in the last lines of his commentary in the Siddur, in Bereshit Perek Kaf, he says, 4 lines in the bottom of source 18, it is not an outflowing from within, an expression of that which the heart is already filled. For that we have other expressions of siach or techina. He says, but is a renewed intake and penetration of truth which comes from outside. It's not that I need Hashem so much, help me please. It's, wait a second, what am I doing to deserve this? Am I measuring up to what it is that I'm asking for? Right, I'm asking for knowledge, but I didn't study for the test. How's that going to work exactly, right? So, do I care about Jerusalem? Do I care about the kibbutz galios? Am I doing something which reflects that in my daily life, or is that just paying homage because I should be saying that? That's the hitpalel. That's to self-judge. That means I'm measuring myself against an objective standard on the outside, which is happening through the process of tefillah. That's what prayer really is, according to Rav Hirsch. Very different conception to what we normally do, not to negate other. He says other words for what we will call traditionally call it. And slavery. I'm going to skip slavery for a second. Just the idea of rehabilitation. Oh, I thought there was only two more concepts. I'm sorry. I thought there were. I'm going to have to skip here. I'm sorry. I'm going to leave this to everybody else. To do this, marriage. Okay, two more ideas. I'm sorry. So marriage. This last week's parsha, Chayasar, Yitzchak marries Rivka, and it says he loves her, but he only loves her after he gets married. So he points out Judaism's idea of love is an investment not based on romance and lust, which is, we'll call precipitates, and the graph is very much up and then down, right? People magazine, right? People magazine's like 6-month marriage, that's not how it works. And he points out that love is something which continues and is a continual investment, which means, say, if you graph it, the more investment continues, and if it should go upwards. It should be linear, algorithmic as it extends. And he points this out to people who perhaps think that, the antiquated system of shidduch and the antiquated system of set-up marriages is more, backwards. He's pointing out that there is value to the idea of love being something which develops through marriage rather before marriage. And finally, the last idea, and this is a very famous idea, a very controversial idea, is actually also this coming week's parsha, and Parshas told us, when it says Vayigdalu Ha'No'arim, that the twins Yaakov and Esav grow up together. And Rav Hirsch points out that Chazal want to be very, very careful, are very open about criticizing the greats of our nation, and they do it many times. And his point over here is that there's a concept called Chanoich Lanar Al Pi Darkoi. You're supposed to educate different children differently, and Rivka and Yitzchak were guilty, therefore, of bringing up two children who are vastly different in the same school system. And that's why there was problems. And he says that if they had recognized that Esav did not deserve to be in a classroom, he was the kind of guy who deserved to be more on the chesed team, right? He's the guy who should have been driving the delivery truck and being a charismatic leader of the army of God. Then perhaps there would have been different outcomes. Which means to say is Vayigdalu Ha'No'arim, the fact that they were grown up together in the same classroom means by per force one of them is going to fail, which is a remarkable idea. This idea of Rav Hirsch being willing to lean in to the critical, to being critical, is a very, very thin tightrope, right? So you'll have those who will say, as we looked at like the Sforno last week, who will never touch that rail. There's always, Sarah was right when she abused Hagar. There's always the right, as we learn. Rav Hirsch says, no, it's all right, Chazal do it. But the problem is that there are those who will take Rav Hirsch and go to the furthest extreme and then treat, completely indifferentially the greats. And this is a very, very, this balance that he makes over here, on the one hand, humanizes, allows us access, at the same time with the greatest amount of deference, which is a very, very unique space. I hope that I'm sure most people knew most of the things that we learned today, but I hope everybody walks away with this just appreciation of this amazing idea and concept.